me, I really needed a break from some of the violence. And this one, I dare say, is quite fun. Not a great word for true crime, but if you guys know the story, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's just so different than everything I've been talking about lately. And normally when I do my dressing up videos, I will wait till a little further in to do so, but now I'm diving in right away today because I am excited. Get yourselves nice and comfortable. Grab yourselves a nice glass of wine, a beverage. Relax and ease your minds as this 50s housewife-ish version of Angel dives into the story of Frank Abagnale. Now, this story does take place, at least in the beginning, in the late 1940s, early 1950s, so I dressed as what I assume a 50s mother would be dressed like. And I'm also going to be drinking what I think they would be. And if you know this story, you're gonna know there's a lot of changes in here, so a lot of different beverages, so it's gonna be fun. Now I was just gonna have some lemonade or like a sherry or something, but I know a lot of wives in the 50s actually liked whiskey or vodka, so I'm just drinking this Jameson's ginger and lime that I've never had before and I'm pretty excited for. So let me grab my glass since I'm, so much better with it, and then we can dive into this crazy story. A plane decided to show up during that. Cheers. Oh my. Housewives party didn't stop. So today's story is about Frank Abagnale Jr. And if you've ever seen Catch Me If You Can with Leo DiCaprio and Tom Hanks, you know that this is such a wild goose chase, and it's really interesting too to kind of go into the aspects of the actual Frank Abagnale and what he did and how he kind of did everything. So I don't know, maybe I'll do a couple of movies that Leo did where it was based off of a true story where criminal activity happened. Who knows? But this one definitely is a tale for the ages. So it starts in 1948 when Frank Abagnale was born in New Rochelle, New York. He was named after his father, who had owned a stationery business, and Frank was the third of 4 children. Fun fact I did not know. His mother, Paulette, was French Algerian and had actually met Frank's father, Frank Sr., when he was on active service in Algiers during World War II. They soon married after having a bit of an age gap, just 13 years. Pretty normal, I guess, back then. But they seemed to be quite happy for a bit. Frank Sr. proved to be a very successful businessman with a stationery store doing exceptionally well. And as a result, the family had moved into a larger home. And although they were by no means like rich or anything, they had quite a comfortable childhood, Frank and all of his siblings. However, Frank attended Loanna Catholic School in Westchester, New York, but his world was flipped upside down and torn apart in 1960 when his parents actually separated. This had came to a shock to all of the children who thought that their mother was a contented housewife. Who they thought had everything she wanted. However, Frank Sr. was very active in local body politics as well as being active in the management of the New York Yacht Club. In addition Frank was like, oh my god, you guys are just so bad at this. So, obviously, they were then thrown into juvie, and Frank Sr.'s political connections managed to get Frank Jr. out, not have any mention of the incident on his record. They erased it. They didn't even put it on there. And Frank's dad told him, listen, you're wasting time hanging out with these kids. big city. The parents offered him to stay as long as he wanted, kind of taking pity on this poor boy. And at that time, he had taken on a job as a stock clerk for about $1.50 an hour. He quickly found out that this was not going to pay his way into New York. He figured that the reason for his low wage must be his age, so he simply altered excess of 1,000,000 miles. Yeah, it was no joke. It's important to note he never actually flown a plane. He simply just kind of sat and deadheaded to different locations. And it was by the middle of 1966 that Frank was now ready for a new gig. He had experienced a lot of fun, I'm sure, flying and he said yes. I feel like that's pretty obvious. Here it's Frank Abagnale, so you know. So he agreed. He went down that path, and it was because once again he found himself. It was irresistible, impossible to turn down. Just like how I found it impossible to not stop drinking with every different role I play because I'm trying to be that person relationship that I'd found in Catch Me If You Can didn't seem to really exist. I could be incredibly wrong, but there was a man, and it was not the same name as the man in the movie. The man's name was Joseph Shea, who was kind of on his trail later on in the story, but we're not talking about that right now. Basically, his luck finally ran out while he was spending time in the southern French town of Montechard. He was arrested on the basis of an Interpol warrant for fraud issued from Sweden for fraudulent checks written during a visit while he was actually still a Pan Am employee, so quite some time ago. The French authorities soon discovered that he had written false checks all over their countries, and so they refused to honor his extradition. Frank was then sentenced to 12 months of imprisonment in France, which, after being reduced to 6 months, was served in Perpignan prison. And the conditions there were not great. And Frank's weight went from 198 to 109 pounds during his stay there due to limited food and good quality food. He was then extradited to Sweden, where he served another 6 months imprisonment. Now, upon his release from Malmo prison in Sweden, Frank was taken into the custody by U.S. federal officers and returned to the United States. After a third trial, he was convicted to 12 years imprisonment for multiple cases of fraud. During this time in U.S. custody, he escaped twice, but was recaptured on both occasions. Yes, he escaped twice. He was just no joke. So, of his escapes, while being deported to the United States, he'd escaped from a British VC-10 airliner as it was turning onto a taxiway at New York's John F. Kennedy Airport. Under the cover of night, he scaled a nearby fence and hailed a taxi cab to Grand Central Terminal. After stalking in the Bronx to change clothes and pick up a set of keys to Montreal Bank safe deposit that had $20,000, which is like $100,000 today, he had caught a train to Montreal's Dorval Airport to purchase a ticket to Sao Paulo. And after a close call, he was apprehended by a constable of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Hey. And while standing in line at the ticket counter, Mounted Police, what up? So he was then handed over to the U.S. Border Patrol. But in addition to that, in 1971, he'd reportedly escaped from the federal detention center in Atlanta, Georgia, while awaiting trial. During the time, U.S. prisoners were being condemned by civil rights groups and investigated by congressional committees. Again, I've had a lot to drink tonight. So in a stroke of luck that included the accompaniment of a U.S. Marshal, forgetting his detention papers, Abagnale was mistaken for an undercover prison inspector and was given privileges and food far better than other inmates. This guy just had a horseshoe up his... Anyway, the cops card as proof. He had told them that he needed to contact FBI agent Sean O'Reilly for a matter of urgent business. So O'Reilly's supposed phone number was dialed and the call was picked up by Gene Sebring at a payphone in Atlantic Shopping Mall, posing as an operator for the FBI. Later, he was allowed to meet unsupervised with the FBI agent in a predetermined car outside of the detention center. Incognito Sebring picked up Abagnale and instead drove him to an Atlanta bus station, where he had taken a Greyhound bus to New York and soon after a train to Washington, D.C. Abagnale then bluffed his way through an attempted capture by posing as an FBI agent after being recognized by a motel registration